This was the aftermath of a plane crash which occurred on a Spanish summer's day on August 29, 2001. It is one of the more underdocumented aviation incidents, which highlighted how a pilot made a simple misjudgment in response to what was later deemed to be a false alarm in the cockpit. The pilots had carried out an emergency procedure on final approach after an alarm showed a fire in one of the plane's engines. Investigators determined that emergency procedures were not followed correctly, as the first officer had switched off both engines. Binter Mediterráneo Flight 8261 crashed short of the runway at Malaga on the south coast of Spain, killing 4 people in the accident. What caused the false alarm in the cockpit, and what did the crew do wrong in this scenario? Malaga is a large city in Andalusia on the south coast of Spain. The city is served by the local airport, which sees a high level of traffic, especially during the summer months. In August, the airport is packed as leisure flights fill the airport stands. Usually this traffic originates from Northern Europe. The airport in Malaga, however, also sees plenty of regional traffic. In 2001, the airline Binter Mediterráneo based its headquarters in Malaga and operated aircraft out of Terminal 1. At the time, the airline, along with its sister airline Binter Canarias, were owned by Iberia, which was also at the time the state-owned national airline in Spain. Binter Mediterráneo also operated hubs out of Madrid and the Spanish exclave of Melilla on the North African coast. On August 29, 2001, Binter operated a routine service between Malaga and Melilla, of which the accident of Flight 8261 occurred. The plane which the airline operated was a Spanish-built regional propeller airliner, the CN-235, manufactured by the Spanish company Construcciones Aeronáuticas S.A. For the sake of brevity, we will be shortening this to the abbreviation of CASA going forward in this video. The Spanish aircraft manufacturer was more known for producing military and miscellaneous transportation aircraft. However, some of their planes could and were configured for passenger services. The CASA 235 was first launched in the 1980s and became a popular plane in the world of military transport. However, the passenger variant failed to see any kind of significant success outside of Spain. In all, nearly 300 of these planes were built, and many operate today in military fleets. In 2001, safety concerns surrounding this plane started to arise after a series of 3 fatal accidents between the months of January and June of that year had killed a total of 41 people. None of these accidents occurred with the commercial passenger variant of the plane, however, and all occurred within the Turkish military. The weather on the day of August 29, 2001 was rather windy, with winds reaching up to 29 knots. Otherwise, it was a warm summer's day with clear skies. The flight out to Melilla was uneventful. The plane had arrived in the Spanish exclave at around 9 a.m. The plane had also been delayed for nearly 40 minutes and spent 38 minutes on the ground in Melilla. Departing as Flight 8261, the Binter Mediterráneo plane left for its return flight back to Malaga at 9:37. Some surviving passengers would later go on to say that the delay may have been linked to the accident. However, investigators could not make that link. The captain on this flight, and the one at the flight controls this morning, was Captain Mariano Hernandez Ruano, age 55. He has served as a pilot for many years, having accumulated over 7,300 flying hours, of which roughly half of those hours have been spent in the CASA 235. He had experience in the Spanish Air Force, where he was a flight instructor on the C-130 Hercules aircraft. He even used to be a private pilot for Malaga's football team. The first officer was also of a similar background. Luis Checa Rodriguez, at age 52, had nearly 8,000 total flying hours. He too also had flying experience in the Spanish military and was handling the radio communications for this flight. The plane which this flight crew was flying today had been built in 1990, accumulating over 14,000 flight hours over the years, with a total of 20,000 flights. The plane had been flown on the Malaga to Melilla route countless times. This flight is rather short, which is only roughly of 35 minutes depending on the landing direction at Malaga. They are scheduled to make an approach onto what was numbered at the time as runway 32. There were 47 people on board, including the crew members. The majority of this short flight was just as uneventful as that of the flight out to Melilla. At 10:03, the pilots established radio communication with air traffic control in Malaga, to which they cleared the plane in for an approach onto runway 32. Flight 8261 then began a descent as intended. For the next 10 minutes, the plane would continue on course and line up for the runway out over the Mediterranean Sea. At 10:13, there was a small breakdown in communication between the plane and the ground in the handoff from the approach controller to the tower control. It took longer than usual for the plane to establish communication with the tower controller. A message from the tower goes unanswered by the plane. However, two-way communication was soon resumed. During this time on board the plane, an alarm had sounded on the flight deck of Flight 8261, which occurred at 10:14. It was the fire alarm relating to the plane's left engine. What the pilots did not know as the alarm had sounded was that there was actually no fire in the engine or anywhere on the plane. This was a false alarm given by the plane to the pilots. The reason as to why this fire alarm had sounded was never fully understood by the investigation. There was, however, evidence to suggest that either dirt or significant moisture in the electrical circuit in the left engine's fire alarm system could have caused the false alarm. Without knowing that this was indeed a false alarm, the pilots would have thought that this alarm was serious. In the event of a fire alarm on board, pilots are taught to treat any fire indication as a potential high-risk emergency. As such, there are procedures in place by all airlines and aircraft manufacturers on how pilots should tackle these situations. Aircraft will often have some kind of quick reference document with these kinds of situations listed with the appropriate steps the pilot should take in a fire scenario. What transpired in the cockpit of Flight 8261 was a distinct lack of crew resource management. The investigation found that the first officer's actions and what followed was the primary cause of the crash. It had been revealed that he did not have any simulator training provided by the airline in emergency situations. The first officer, who was handling the radio communication, had transmitted the following message to the tower at 10:14. "We are on short final, we have a fire in an engine, and we are declaring an emergency." So the ground was now notified of a fire situation on board in an unspecified engine. The tower then runs through their procedures of alerting ground and emergency services as precaution. Flight 8261 is now just a few miles from the runway. While the captain was still handling the flight controls, the first officer was running through an emergency checklist for an engine fire. Commercial aircraft have dedicated firefighting systems on board. A lot of the time, these can be seen in the cockpit as fire handles. The same is true on the CASA CN-235. When the fire handle is activated, fuel is cut from the engine, so that engine will now shut down. Halon gas is also injected into the engine to attempt to kill any fire. Although, in the case of Binter Mediterráneo Flight 8261, there was no fire in either of the plane's engines. As the first officer was running through the fire procedures, they inadvertently activated both of the plane's fire handles, shutting down the plane's two engines. Had just the left engine, which was providing the false fire alarm signal, been shut down, the plane could have landed safely on just the remaining engine. However, without that second engine and with a few miles still to fly to the runway, the plane has now lost its thrust and begins to lose speed and descend below the glide slope. At just before 10:16, the ground proximity warning system was audible in the cockpit. The sole flight attendant on board also entered the flight deck. That conversation, as recorded by the cockpit voice recorder, was indecipherable. What is known, however, is that the pilots did not notify the flight attendant of imminent danger on board, and as such did not prepare the cabin for a crash landing. Passengers also did not assume any bracing position, as they had no idea of what was unfolding in the cockpit. Moments later, the pilots realized that both engines had actually now stopped functioning. The captain had questioned the first officer, quoting, "Which engine did you stop?" The first officer then relays the information to the tower that they now have no engines and are gliding towards the ground. 14 seconds later, the plane lands precisely 538 meters short of runway 32 at Malaga, touching down in a field where the airport's approach lighting equipment is set up. At this moment, the plane is still carrying momentum as it continues further ahead towards a road embankment that runs perpendicular to the runway. Flight 8261 damages runway lighting equipment along the way, skidding to the left of the center line of the runway, where it eventually crashes into the south side embankment of the N340 motorway. Almost immediately following the crash, emergency services arrived on the site. First responders, in the form of passing motorists on the motorway, pulled over to try and help passengers out of the wreckage, but the doors inside were jammed, and for 10 minutes, surviving passengers were trapped inside the plane's fuselage. It was not until one of the passengers on board was able to open the rear entry door that passengers could leave the plane. The wreckage was later transported to a CASA manufacturing plant in Sevilla for analysis. The crash killed 4 people, including Captain Mariano Hernandez Ruano. The official investigation determined that the cause of the crash was the incorrect execution of emergency procedures by the first officer and the inadvertent shutdown of both of the plane's engines. The airline was also blamed for the crash. Binter Mediterráneo had not provided adequate simulator training to the first officer, and the flight operations manuals that were used by the airline were also looked at by investigators. They too were also deemed to be unsatisfactory, as they did not conform to recommendations for procedures set out by the plane's manufacturer. CASA, the manufacturer itself, was absorbed into Airbus, forming the Airbus Military Division, where new CN-235s and its successor the CN-295 are still produced. As for Binter Mediterráneo, the operator of Flight 8261, the airline ceased operations the very day of the accident on August 29, 2001. Its resources were later sold to the privately owned airline Air Nostrum, which was a franchise airline under Iberia. It's now Iberia that operate the routes across the Mediterranean to the Spanish exclave of Melilla. Binter Mediterráneo's sister airline, Binter Canarias, still flies to this day and has proved to be a successful regional airline in the Canary Islands. Hello everyone, thank you once again for watching today's video. This has actually been the second of 2 videos this week. The other one was uploaded on Tuesday, and I must thank you all for the incredible response on that video. I don't think in my 10 years of video production I have ever made a video that has grown as fast and to that level as the Luxair video, so I thank you all for that. It is that time to once again thank my patrons. If you would like to get your name featured or read out at the end of the next video, you can join my Patreon, and the link to that will be in the pinned comment. So a thank you to my £5 patrons, Aidan Montgomery, D. Rogers, Hector Palmatellas, KTP123, Ken Zachman, Marie Ennis, and Wrong Track 58. A thank you to you guys. And a big thanks to my £10 patrons for their incredible and generous support, Cherub Cherub, Daniel Hendricks, Side Effect, and Will Tanner. Your support, as always, is greatly appreciated. Thank you. And that is it from me today. It has been a long week, but have a great weekend, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.